Hello, welcome to Hands-on on JavaScript modules. Today we're going to be looking at JavaScript modules. We're going to be discussing what JavaScript module is. We're going to be looking at why we need JavaScript module. We're going to also see what difference it makes adding JavaScript modules to our JavaScript code. And after that, we're going to play with a little code snippet on JavaScript module so that we can have a deeper understanding of how it works, the advantages it brings to the table. And I guess after this course, everybody will be able to add it to their JavaScript code or code base. So let's go. So what are JavaScript modules? JavaScript modules are a reusable piece of JavaScript code which exports specific objects. So just to break this down, so a JavaScript module is just a JavaScript code base broken down into smaller JavaScript files. So in this file, you have smaller pieces of code that do specific things, which you can then export and import in another JavaScript file, which contains another code, and you can also make use of the code you exported from a JavaScript file, from one JavaScript file inside another JavaScript file. So imagine we have maybe a user's object that does something, maybe greet user. We can actually break it down by creating a JavaScript module that contains the user's object. Then we have a main module in which we import the user object from the user JavaScript module and consume the user object in the main file. So that's what JavaScript module is all about. So it's broken down into the JavaScript module help us to break down our code into smaller piece of files, JavaScript files that contains JavaScript objects, or you can put anything in those files and export it and consume it, import it in a different file, and make use of the JavaScript code you wrote in the previous file. So we can say it helps us create a reusable piece of JavaScript code. So that's just basically what JavaScript module is all about. Why do we need JavaScript module? Enables the import and export of JavaScript file. So like I said previously, you can actually with the help of JavaScript module, you can actually export a code in a piece of JavaScript file, a piece of code in a JavaScript file, and actually import it in another piece of JavaScript file, in a code in another piece of JavaScript file, and make use of that code you have in the file you exported previously. So reusable is actually giving us the ability to make use of reusable codes. It breaks down JavaScript code base into smaller files. So you have instead of having your conventional traditional million lines of JavaScript code, you can actually, with the help of JavaScript module, you can break down the JavaScript code base into smaller files and just makes your code neater and better. So those are the major two advantages of JavaScript modules, and nothing more, and much more. Let me not say nothing more. Yeah. So having said this, let's dive in and see practical code example on JavaScript module. So here I have my Visual Studio Code open, and also I have a console open, a web console open. So in this code base, you see I have three files. I have my index.js, I have the main.js, I have the user.js. But I'm going to take out the user.js now and just continue with the main.js, so we can gradually see why the JavaScript module has much effect than the conventional top to bottom way of writing our JavaScript code base. So let's start. Now, assuming we have a function called user, function called user. So we want to make our user a constructor function, and our user constructor function, we have two parameters, which is first name, which we'll set to first name, and we'll also have this dot last name, which we'll set to last name, and we're going to get those parameters when we instantiate the new objects. And last name, and also we want our constructor function to have a get phone name function, we want this to be a function. Let's make it an arrow function. So this function will return a concatenated value on the first name and the last name. So we'll say this dot first name, and we have this dot this dot last name. So here we have our constructor function. So it does a very simple thing, nothing too much about this. It just gets the first name and the last name of the user, creates a new instance, assign the first name and the last name to the first name and last name property, and has also a property that is a function that gets the full name, which returns the concatenated value of the first name and the last name. Then also we want to have a function that greets the user. So we'll say greets user, and what we want to pass into this is the username. We'll say user full name. So what this function is going to do is going to just return. It's returning a string that says hello, and passing the user full name, and that's just it. So now it's time for us to consume our constructor function and our greet user function. So here we say const John. We're about to create the John object is equals to new, and we say user, then we pass in our the name of the full name of John. So we say first name should be John and the second name should be Doe. So we've created a new instance of John. Then below we can come down and say console.log, and we have say John, which is now a new object, John.get full name, and let's also do this below console.log. We call the greet user function and we pass the John full name. So we say greet user, then we pass in the John.get full name. Good. So this is actually going to get the full name of John, pass it into the greet user function, and it's going to return a string with the greetings. So once we save this, let's go to our index.js and make sure everything is properly placed. Yeah, everything is properly placed. So we should have Yeah, we should have okay, fix that. I think I had a problem with my import statement. I had to remove this JavaScript type so that it can load directly. I think I had the wrong spelling on that. So that's fixed. So now we can see we have our John Doe as the user's full name, and we have greet user function returning hello John Doe. So you can see this is the conventional way of writing your JavaScript. We write our JavaScript code previously, but with JavaScript with JavaScript modules we can actually make this better. So how do we make this better? If you notice, we find out that we can actually move this into a different file with the help of JavaScript module. We can move this into a different file, the user function, and we can also move this into a different file, the greet function. So that file, we handle everything that has to do with both the user first name, and anytime we need to make modifications or update the user constructor function, we just go to that piece of file, edit it there, and export it, and come to the main.js, import it, and actually make use of it. It makes our code cleaner and actually organized. So how do we do that? We create a new file. We call it user.js. So in user.js, we want to take this user function and we want to put it here. So also, let's see, we also want to take the greet user function and we want to put it here also. So anytime we create the JavaScript module, we should always have a default export option. So we say export default, then we choose which of the main function that we should export defaultly. My advice is you export the main function that does the main job tags or the main tags in that module. So what does the main tags in this module is the user constructor function. So we say we export the user function. So we can also implicitly export other functions that are not actually the default functions or objects in this module. So we can do something like this: export function greet user. So this means that we can actually access this when we import this user.js file into our other user.js module into our other JavaScript file, but we have to reference the greet username directly. But on default import of this user module, what we immediately have access to is the user object. So we can also do this if we decide not to do the default exports explicitly. Export the default user. We can also do it implicitly by doing export default this, and it's still going to work. But I advise we do it the previous way, which is to explicitly export it at the bottom of the file, because most developers, when they go into your file, they just want to see your JS module. They just want to go down and see what you defaultly exported, and they know, okay, this is where we'll start from in this file. So having done that, let's save. So once we save, we bring in come to our main.js. If we try to save this, you see we get an error, user is not defined. So how do we bring in the JavaScript module here? So for us to bring in the JavaScript module here, we use the import statement, and we give it a variable name, import user. We can use the capital letter U since you're importing an object, user from, then we specify the file. So we can actually choose to use a relative path by saying user.js and click on save, or we can actually decide to use an absolute path user.js and click on save. But anyone that works for you, use based on your folder or file structure. So I'll choose to use the relative path. So we'll bring in the user.js and we click on save. You will notice that uncaught syntax error, use import statements outside a module in main.js. So why is this happening? That's because we need to specify to our HTML document that our JavaScript file is actually containing modules. So how do we do that? We say type is equals to what? Module. So when we click on save, we should see that the error has changed to uncaught reference error, user is not defined. So it means it's identifying the file, it knows what the file is all about, and it can tell us the problem with the file. So we go back to our main.js to fix that. So we see on line 3. Now we go to line 3, we see that we have the user where we have the small letter u, and instead we have the user where we have the capital letter U. So let's fix that. So we copy this and replace with this, and when we click on save, now we can see that the first console log on line 5 is working, which actually gets the full name of the user that we just created. But we found out that the second console log on line 7 returns an error that says uncaught reference error, greet user is not defined. Remember, we actually implicitly exported that function, and that was not the default export. So our main.js cannot access the file, the greet user function, because it was not the default export option. So how do we bring it in? You can bring it in by specifying an object and actually calling the name of the function inside that object. So you just go back and add greet user, which is done here for us, and when you click on save, everything works as it is. So we can also make use of alias by saying import greet user as greetings. Sorry about that, greetings. So when we save, because we've created an alias, main.js can no longer see the greet user directly, instead to see the alias. So all we do is replace the greet user with the alias and save, and everything would begin to work as it was working before. So that's the whole pack that JavaScript module brings to the table. When we're working with JavaScript, we are able to build our code in smaller pieces, export different objects, different functions, and we can also import them in different files, make use of them, and everything still work as it's supposed to work. So that's one of the most wonderful things of JavaScript. So we see with this, we can actually have reusable piece of code. We can create another file and still make use of this user code and this user object and the greet user function, even without tampering with any of our previous code. And when we want to maintain this code, it's such very maintainable that anytime we need to modify the user, we just know that we have to go to the user.js file, look for the user object, do the modification, and immediately the main.js is affected by that modification. So you can see we have a smaller code base. We also have our JavaScript code splitted into reusable pieces of code. So another thing we should note here is between 2019 backward, most browser compatibility do not work with modules, but I think of recent, most of the updated versions of browsers should work with modules. So if for some other browsers that don't understand what module is, you can actually use the script no module type equals no module, and put in the script you want to run when there is no module, and those old browsers will ignore this and run this because you specified no module. So that's also one of the things. I also forget to put in the differ. So the differ actually makes the script run immediately after everything on your DOM, which is your document, has rendered successfully. So with those little changes to an addition of JavaScript module, we can find out that developing JavaScript is becoming quite easy. It's becoming quite maintainable and scalable because we have our code broken down into different chunks of smaller pieces of reusable code. So that's it. Thank you for listening to this course. I hope this helped you. If you have any addition, any comment, any suggestion, or you notice I didn't do something in the right way, please feel free to drop your suggestion, comments in the comment box. And yeah, let's keep coding. Happy coding. Thank you for listening once again. Stay blessed.